When most of us imagine ancient Egypt, our minds are filled with images of mighty pharaohs, towering pyramids, and golden treasures buried deep beneath the sands. It is a civilization wrapped in mystery, power, and timeless grandeur.
But what if I told you that the true heart of ancient Egypt wasn't just found in the palaces of kings, but in the kitchens of ordinary homes, in the bustling chatter of markets, and in the ink-stained fingers of humble scribes? This is the story that lies beyond the pharaohs. A story of farmers who turned floods into food, women who shaped families and businesses, priests who held the keys to the sacred, and artisans who carved eternity into stone. Tonight, we step away from the throne and into the lives of the people who built a civilization so enduring it still whispers to us across thousands of years. To understand Egypt, you must first understand the Nile. The Greek historian Herodotus once called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And he was right. Every year, like clockwork, the river would swell with floods, spilling rich black silt onto the land. Without this rhythm, there would have been no crops, no food, no life. For ordinary Egyptians, this cycle was as sacred as any temple ritual. Farmers rose before the sun, walking barefoot into damp soil. Men guided oxen pulling wooden plows, while women and children scattered seeds of barley, wheat, and flax. Along the banks, fishermen cast their nets from reed boats, pulling in tilapia and Nile perch, fish that would fill clay jars with salted meat for leaner seasons. The river was alive not just with animals, but with crocodiles lurking just below the surface, and sacred ibises strutting among the reeds. The Nile wasn't only for food, it was the nation's highway. Traders loaded boats with baskets of onions, leeks, and beer drifting downriver to markets. For Egyptians, every grain and every catch was a gift from the gods. Step away from the fields, and you find yourself in an Egyptian village. Here, most homes were made of mud brick, sun-dried blocks stacked into square walls, flat roofs, and tiny windows to keep out the heat. Inside, the wealthy might enjoy painted walls, decorated with lotus flowers and hunting scenes. They had courtyards where fig trees grew, and servants baked bread in clay ovens. Their furniture included low wooden stools, chests for clothing, and even woven mats painted in bright colors. But for the majority, life was simpler. Many lived in one-room houses with little more than reed mats for beds and clay jars for storage. Smoke from small cooking fires clung to the walls. In these cramped spaces, families gathered at night around simple meals: bread, onions, garlic, figs, and clay cups of beer. Life wasn't easy, but it was warm and communal. Children played with dolls made of rags and clay or chased each other through dusty alleys. Women spent hours grinding grain and weaving linen. Men repaired tools or tended goats in courtyards. And above all, there was the hum of daily survival, ordinary yet timeless. It is here, in these humble homes, that the true story of Egypt is written. To live in ancient Egypt was to live in the presence of the divine. Religion wasn't just part of life, it was life. From sunrise to sunset, every action carried a spiritual meaning. The Nile's flood was a gift from Hapi, the river god. The sun that blazed each morning was Ra sailing across the heavens. Even the smallest household prayed for protection from gods like Bes, the dwarf protector, or Taweret, the goddess of childbirth. At the heart of this belief system stood the temples, not just places of worship, but the beating centers of power and economy.
Temples owned vast estates of farmland. They collected taxes and grain, employed priests, scribes, and laborers, and acted as banks for the community.
Step inside a grand temple, and you enter a sacred world. Giant columns painted in bright blues, reds, and greens soar like stone forests. The air is thick with incense. Priests dressed in spotless white linen chant hymns as they offer bread, beer, and meat to golden statues of the gods. Ordinary Egyptians were not allowed in the innermost sanctuary. Only priests and the pharaoh himself could gaze upon the sacred idol. The Egyptians believed in rituals so powerful they could bridge the gap between life and death. Among the most sacred was the opening of the mouth ceremony, performed for the dead to restore their senses for the afterlife. Priests, holding ritual tools, touched the mummy's lips and eyes, ensuring the soul could eat, speak, and see in eternity.
For Egyptians, the world was alive with gods, and temples were the crossroads where heaven touched earth. If the temples were the heart of Egypt, then writing was its memory. The Egyptians were masters of the written word, and their scribes were among the most respected members of society. Scribes recorded everything: harvests, taxes, trade, court cases, hymns, even letters between families. Without them, the empire could not function. Literacy was rare, reserved for the sons of the elite and for those who devoted themselves to years of training. To hold the reed pen was to hold power. Imagine a scribe seated cross-legged on the floor, a wooden pallet on his lap. In tiny jars sat black ink made from soot and red ink made from ochre. With a sharpened reed, he dipped and scratched symbols onto papyrus scrolls, tiny pictures that told stories, laws, and prayers. Hieroglyphs for the sacred, hieratic script for everyday use.
Young boys trained in House of Life schools, often attached to temples. Their lessons were harsh. Teachers barked instructions while students copied signs onto broken pottery shards. Mistakes were met with sharp discipline. One ancient school text warned, "A boy's ears are on his back. He listens when he is beaten." For those who persevered, the rewards were enormous.
Scribes lived comfortable lives, free from manual labor. They became advisors to generals, secretaries to priests, and accountants for farmers. They were guardians of wisdom, bridging generations with their scrolls. But their work went beyond practical records. Scribes preserved magical spells in the Book of the Dead, wrote hymns to the gods, and copied medical texts filled with cures both practical and mystical. They turned knowledge into immortality. And so, while pharaohs commanded armies and priests spoke to gods, it was the scribes who ensured that Egypt's voice would echo through the ages. Without them, the stories of pyramids, kings, and daily life would have vanished into silence. While temples soared skyward and scribes filled papyrus with ink, another group carried the weight of Egypt on their shoulders: its soldiers. For most of Egypt's history, the army was not a standing force, but made up of farmers called to service. A man might spend half the year tilling his fields, and the other half marching in formation along the desert sands. In return, he might be rewarded with land, food rations, or a share of war booty. Equipped with shields of wood and hide, spears tipped with bronze, and later composite bows, they stood as guardians of the Nile.
In times of invasion, they faced Libyan raiders, Nubian warriors, and eventually mighty empires like the Hittites. Yet soldiers were more than fighters, they were also builders. The same hands that held a spear could also haul stones for temples or dig canals for irrigation. But life was not all glory. Taxes weighed heavily on peasants. Grain was measured and collected, often leaving families with only enough to scrape by. Scribes recorded every bushel owed, while tax collectors ensured the pharaoh's treasury never dry ran. And when the burden grew too heavy, Egyptians pushed back. One of history's earliest recorded labor strikes took place at Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans who built the royal tombs. When wages of grain were withheld, workers laid down their tools and marched in protest, demanding their due. Even in a land ruled by kings and gods, ordinary people raised their voices for fairness. These daily struggles remind us, ancient Egypt was not only pyramids and palaces, but sweat, sacrifice, and the resilience of its people. If the soldiers guarded Egypt's borders, it was women who safeguarded its heart. Unlike in many ancient cultures, Egyptian women enjoyed surprising freedoms. They could own property, inherit wealth, and run businesses. They could even divorce their husbands and keep custody of their children, rights that would not return in some societies for thousands of years. Family life was central to Egyptian society. Marriage was less about ceremony and more about partnership. Husbands and wives were often depicted side by side in tomb paintings, holding hands as equals. Children were cherished, and large families were considered a blessing. Mothers were respected, not only as caretakers, but as symbols of fertility and continuity. Some women rose to extraordinary heights. Hatshepsut, for instance, declared herself pharaoh, one of the few women to rule Egypt as king. She wore the royal false beard, built grand temples, and sent trading expeditions to far-off lands. Yet she also faced opposition, and later rulers tried to erase her name from history. But most women lived quieter lives, as merchants selling jewelry in the market, as musicians playing harps at festivals, or as priestesses in temples. Their influence, though often subtle, shaped the rhythms of daily life. Festivals brought families together in joy. Streets filled with the sound of flutes and drums, dancers crowned with lotus garlands, feasts of roasted goose, figs, and sweet honey cakes. These moments of laughter and music show us an Egypt that was not just sacred and serious, but vibrant and alive. So what is the true legacy of ancient Egypt? Is it the towering pyramids, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the colossal statues that still stand watch over the desert? Yes, but the deeper truth lies elsewhere. It lies in the hands of the farmers who tilled the soil, in the voices of the women who kept families strong, in the careful strokes of scribes who gave memory to stone. It lies in the unseen artisans who carved the hieroglyphs, in the nameless laborers who carried limestone blocks, and in the priests who whispered prayers in the shadows of temples. Egypt's greatness was never just the pharaohs. It was a civilization built by millions of ordinary people, whose labor, devotion, and imagination turned a strip of desert into the most enduring culture the world has ever known. Today, archaeologists still kneel in the sand, brushing away grains to reveal clay pots, tools, and toys, fragments of lives long forgotten. And in each discovery, the story of Egypt becomes clearer. Not just kings and crowns, but a people whose legacy is as rich and eternal as the Nile itself.